Imagine the clang of iron gates, the deafening roar of a crowd in Paris, and the hiss of a blade cutting through air. The French Revolution is remembered for its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it is also remembered for its instruments of fear. The guillotine and the dungeon, one public and spectacular, the other hidden and silent, became symbols of power, punishment, and terror. To understand the revolution, we must step into both the squares and the shadows. The guillotine was not just a machine, it was a theater. Introduced in 1792 as a supposedly humane alternative to older methods of execution, it quickly became the central stage of revolutionary justice. Yet behind the cheers and the chants, the guillotine was more than a tool of death. It was a weapon of spectacle, designed to remind citizens that the revolution had the power to decide who lived and who died. But if the guillotine was the revolution's face, the dungeon was its hidden hand. Beneath the streets of Paris, in places like the Conciergerie and La Force prison, thousands of men and women awaited their fate. Some would see daylight again. Many would not. The dungeon was a place of silence, uncertainty, and psychological torment, where rumors of execution hung heavier than the chains on the prisoners' wrists. This is the story of how two forms of punishment, the public guillotine and the hidden dungeon, defined the French Revolution's reign of fear. The guillotine was born out of Enlightenment ideals. Before its introduction, executions in France varied wildly depending on one's social class. Nobles were decapitated by sword, a relatively quick death, while commoners were hanged, burned, or broken on the wheel, often suffering long and agonizing ends. Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotine, a physician and deputy of the National Assembly, argued that every citizen deserved equality not only in life but in death. A single method of execution, swift and uniform, would embody this new principle of equality. In April 1792, the guillotine was first tested. By June, it stood ready in Paris. At first, its use was relatively rare. But as the revolution deepened and political paranoia grew, the guillotine became a near-daily sight in the city's squares. Crowds gathered eagerly, children perched on shoulders, vendors sold snacks, and executioners became celebrities. The Place de la Révolution, once a space of royal grandeur, became the blood-soaked stage of the revolution. The guillotine stood tall, its blade gleaming in the sun. To its left, the River Seine carried away whispers of fear. To its right, the city's heart beat with a mixture of dread and fascination. Even in its efficiency, the guillotine carried symbolic weight. Its vertical blade was not just steel, it was the revolution's final judgment, indifferent to birth or wealth. Kings, queens, generals, poets, and peasants all met the same fate under its fall. Most famously, King Louis XVI, condemned as a traitor, mounted the scaffold on January 21, 1793. His death marked the death of monarchy itself in France. Marie Antoinette followed that October, carried to the scaffold in a simple cart, her hair shorn, her dignity stripped. She was not treated as a queen in her final moments, but as a symbol of excess to be erased. The crowd cheered louder than ever, convinced they were watching history itself come to an end. Yet the guillotine spectacle was not always straightforward. Some Parisians attended executions as though they were festivals, even collecting blood-soaked souvenirs. Others watched in horror, unable to reconcile the revolution's promise of liberty with the growing tide of death. Writers like Thomas Carlyle later described the guillotine as a terrible altar, upon which the revolution sacrificed its own children. If the guillotine represented visible justice, the dungeon represented invisible fear. Paris's prisons swelled with prisoners, royalists, priests, political enemies, even those accused on the flimsiest of suspicions. The Conciergerie, located on the Isle de la Cite, became infamous as the antechamber to the guillotine. Its damp stone walls, barred windows, and cold corridors housed some of the revolution's most famous victims. Prisoners in the Conciergerie lived under constant uncertainty. At dawn, lists of the condemned were read. Some would be led out to the waiting carts, bound for the guillotine. The rest remained, tortured by the knowledge that tomorrow their names might be called. The psychological weight was crushing. Accounts describe prisoners listening for the sound of carts rolling over cobblestones, knowing each rumble meant death for someone inside their ranks. La Force Prison, another notorious site, housed both common criminals and those caught in the political tides of the revolution. In September 1792, mobs stormed its gates, convinced that royalists and traitors were plotting from within. What followed became known as the September Massacres. Hundreds of prisoners slaughtered in their cells by citizens fueled with revolutionary fury. The state had not ordered these killings, but the message was clear. The dungeon was not only a place of confinement, but also a death trap. The prisons of Paris became microcosms of the revolution itself. Inside, hierarchies formed, rumors spread like fire, and survival depended on alliances as much as innocence. Some prisoners carved their names into the walls, leaving behind silent testaments to their fate. Others composed letters smuggled to loved ones, the last fragments of their lives before silence consumed them. What made the dungeon so terrifying was not its brutality but its uncertainty. The guillotine offered closure, however grim. The dungeon offered only waiting days, weeks, sometimes months of not knowing. In the silence of stone corridors, prisoners wrestled with despair, hope, and betrayal. For many, the dungeon broke the spirit before the blade claimed the body. One striking aspect of the revolution was how it blurred the line between justice and vengeance. Revolutionary tribunals worked at breakneck speed, often condemning dozens in a single day. Evidence was thin, trials were short, and suspicion alone could seal a person's fate. From the guillotine stage to the dungeon's shadows, punishment was not just about crime, it was about control. The Terror, which peaked between 1793 and 1794, saw the guillotine working almost constantly. In Paris alone, thousands were executed. The prisons overflowed, not just with nobles or counter-revolutionaries, but with anyone accused of lukewarm enthusiasm for the cause. Housewives, lawyers, and even children found themselves behind bars. The revolution devoured not only its enemies but often its own supporters. One of the most chilling figures of this period was Maximilien Robespierre, who believed that terror was essential to preserving the revolution's purity. Terror, he argued, is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. Under his vision, the guillotine and the dungeon were not signs of cruelty, but tools of virtue. They were meant to cleanse society of corruption and betrayal. Yet even Robespierre himself would fall victim to the machine he had defended. In July 1794, he was arrested, imprisoned in the Conciergerie, and sent to the guillotine without a proper trial. The revolution had turned against him, proving that no one was safe from its instruments of fear. The guillotine and the dungeon together created a society where fear reigned supreme. The public spectacle of the blade warned citizens of the consequences of betrayal, while the silent terror of the dungeon reminded them that suspicion could strike anyone, anywhere. Together, they became the twin symbols of revolutionary justice, one loud and visible, the other quiet and suffocating. As the terror subsided after Robespierre's fall, the guillotine's blade slowed. Executions became less frequent, and the prisons slowly emptied. Yet the memory of those years remained burned into France's collective memory. For some, the guillotine was a symbol of equality, delivering the same fate to kings and commoners alike. For others, it was a nightmare, proof that ideals of liberty could be twisted into instruments of control. The dungeon, too, left its mark. The Conciergerie still stands today, a silent witness to the revolution's darkest chapters. Tourists walk its halls, imagining the voices of prisoners long gone. The silence of its stones still whispers of fear, of waiting, of the unseen power of confinement. The French Revolution promised freedom, but it also delivered fear. The guillotine and the dungeon remind us that power often walks hand in hand with violence, and that the ideals of justice can become tangled with the machinery of control. The guillotine may have dominated the squares of Paris, but beneath the surface of the French Revolution lurked another world, hidden behind thick walls and iron doors. It was the world of dungeons, prisons, and secret chambers, places where silence was enforced not by a falling blade, but by damp stone and endless confinement. While the guillotine drew crowds with its swift and theatrical display of justice, the dungeon represented something darker and more private. It was not about spectacle, it was about erasure. For the revolutionaries, prisons became essential tools of control. Old royal fortresses like the Bastille had already been torn down, their ruins celebrated as symbols of tyranny's fall. Yet the revolutionaries did not abandon the dungeon, they reinvented it. Thousands found themselves crammed into places like the Conciergerie, a foreboding Gothic palace-turned-prison that stood beside the Seine. Once a seat of royal power, it now became a waiting room for the guillotine, housing men, women, and even children who were accused of treason against the new republic. Conditions inside were harrowing. Overcrowded, disease-ridden, and filled with despair, these prisons became as deadly as any execution square. Prisoners often wasted away, not from a blade, but from hunger, illness, and neglect. Some revolutionaries argued this was justice, that enemies of the people did not deserve comfort. But others feared the rot of the prisons was corroding the revolution itself, staining its ideals with cruelty. Perhaps the most famous prisoner to pass through these dungeons was Marie Antoinette. After months of captivity, she was held in a cell at the Conciergerie before facing trial. She had once lived in the gilded halls of Versailles. Now she sat in a damp, dimly lit cell, guarded around the clock. Witnesses wrote of her pale, hollowed face, her body weakened by confinement. To many, she symbolized the fall of monarchy. Yet her treatment also revealed how far the revolution had traveled from its promises of liberty. The Conciergerie was not unique. All across France, prisons overflowed. Revolutionary committees issued arrest warrants by the thousands, accusing citizens of conspiracy, counter-revolution, or even careless words. Entire families could vanish behind stone walls with little explanation. These arrests weren't only about crime, they were about fear. Fear that enemies lurked in every corner. Fear that loyalty could shift in a whisper. Fear that the revolution could collapse from within. The dungeon became the embodiment of that fear, swallowing lives in silence. But what happened inside these cells? For many, it was a life of waiting. Waiting for trial, waiting for pardon, or waiting for the cart that would carry them to the guillotine. Days blurred into nights, punctuated only by the shouts of guards, the scraping of chains, or the distant cries of other prisoners. Some tried to write letters, smuggle notes, or pray for deliverance. Others lost themselves to madness. In these spaces, the human spirit was tested not by spectacle, but by monotony and despair. There were also dungeons that served another, quieter purpose. Some captives were not executed but simply locked away, forgotten by the outside world. For the revolutionaries, this was a way of neutralizing threats without the spectacle of blood. But for the prisoners, it was a living death. Historians note how some detainees begged to be taken to the guillotine rather than endure endless confinement. At least the blade offered an end. And yet, amid the stone and chains, there were glimpses of resistance. Prisoners carved messages into the walls, recording their names, their hopes, or their final prayers. Some cells bore scratched words like Liberté or Vive le Roi, reminders that even in captivity, people clung to belief. Others sang revolutionary songs to keep their spirits alive. These voices, faint and fleeting, remind us that even the dungeon could not fully erase the human will. One of the most chilling aspects of this era was the randomness of imprisonment. In the fervor of the Reign of Terror, accusations could spread like wildfire. A neighbor's suspicion, a rival's jealousy, or an overheard remark could land someone in a cell. Some who had once cheered the guillotine found themselves awaiting its blade. Revolutionary leaders themselves were not immune. Figures like Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre would eventually pass through the same prisons they once filled. The revolution consumed its own children, and the dungeon was both stage and witness to this cannibalistic cycle. The use of imprisonment also raises deeper questions about justice. The revolution claimed to fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But in practice, liberty was often stripped away not just by execution, but by incarceration. The dungeon did not discriminate by class. Nobles, priests, peasants, merchants, and artisans all found themselves behind bars. Yet even here, inequality persisted. Wealthy prisoners could sometimes bribe guards for better food or more comfortable quarters, while the poor suffered in filth and hunger. The revolution sought to erase privilege, but in the shadows of the dungeon, privilege endured. The end of the Reign of Terror did not bring immediate relief. Prisons remained crowded, and many continued to languish in cells even after the fall of Robespierre. For some, freedom eventually came, but for others, their lives had already been destroyed. Families broken, property lost, health ruined. The scars of the dungeon did not vanish with release. They lingered in memory, shaping how survivors viewed the revolution in the years that followed. And yet, the guillotine and the dungeon were not just instruments of terror. They were symbols. The guillotine was the revolution's public face, a blade that claimed to act in the name of equality. The dungeon, by contrast, was the revolution's hidden conscience, exposing its darker impulses. Together, they reveal the contradictions of an age that sought to build a new world but often stumbled into the same patterns of cruelty it claimed to destroy. As we step back from the darkness of that time, we can see how these instruments of punishment reflected larger struggles. The guillotine promised swift justice but became a machine of fear. The dungeon offered containment but became a space of silence and erasure. Both remind us that revolutions, no matter how noble their ideals, can be twisted by fear, suspicion, and the hunger for control. Today, the Conciergerie still stands in Paris, its Gothic halls open to visitors. Tourists walk through the same rooms where prisoners once waited for death. The cells have been restored, but they retain an air of sorrow, echoing with the memory of those who passed through. In the dim light, one can almost hear the whispers of the forgotten, the quiet defiance of a scratched word on stone, the shuffle of chains, the final prayer of a queen who once wore a crown. The guillotine may no longer stand in the squares, and the dungeons may no longer hold the condemned, but their shadows linger. They remind us that power always carries the temptation to silence, control, and destroy, and they challenge us to ask, what does justice truly mean, and how far should society go in the name of security or revolution? The French Revolution is often remembered for its ideals: liberty, equality, fraternity. But it should also be remembered for its failures, the moments when fear overcame freedom, when punishment became a spectacle, and when prisons became graves for the living. It is in this balance of light and darkness, hope and horror, that the true story of the revolution lies. History echoes not only in the great speeches and victories but also in the hidden corners, the damp cells, and the silent walls. To remember the guillotine without the dungeon is to see only half the picture. To remember both is to understand the revolution in full, with all its brilliance, contradictions, and shadows. So when we look back at that tumultuous time, let us not only marvel at the courage of the people who rose against tyranny. Let us also pause at the silence of the dungeon, at the weight of forgotten names, and at the haunting truth that revolutions are never pure. They are always messy, always human, and always shadowed by the same forces they seek to overthrow. The guillotine cut swiftly, but the dungeon endured quietly. Both stand as warnings, carved into stone and memory, of what happens when ideals are swallowed by fear. And perhaps in that warning lies the most important lesson the French Revolution has left us.